Okay, so we're going to talk about the types of things that can impact the population in an ecosystem. So I'm going to start over here with my predator and my prey. So I'm going to start by labeling my graph, and down here I have time. Oh, this is going to be too big. Just don't need that. And over here I've got population. So time is my independent variable, population is the dependent variable, and I'm going to draw two lines. So first I'm not going to necessarily say what the lines are. I'm just going to draw them and see if you can determine who they are based upon what we know about a population. Okay, so I'm going to choose, let's start with red. Now, color doesn't necessarily matter. Okay. So I have one population here, and I've got another population here. Okay, so if you take a moment to look at this, it should be pretty apparent which line is which, because we know based upon the energy pyramid, remember, if I'm going to put that up here to remind you, and we learned about our 10% rule, that we lose energy as we go up the food chain, and only 10% moves from trophic level to trophic level to trophic level, okay? So if I look here, I know right away which one is my predators and which one is my prey. And the prey has to be the one with the higher population, because the prey always has to be higher than the predator. And we know this because of that energy and our 10% rule. So what I see here is that I initially start with a low population of predators, and my prey population goes up pretty quick. We see a big increase because there's not a lot of predators. But when we watch in the predator graph, we see that they're following a similar, although slightly delayed, increase. And as this population gets higher, you're going to see a sharp decrease in the amount of prey. Because my population, let's say this is a population of hares, rabbits, and Canadian lynx. The rabbits are going to reproduce really quick, but so follows the lynx, and as they get more, they're going to need to eat more, because remember, the energy pyramid, and we're going to see a decrease in our predators. Once those become so low, it's also too low to support the lynx population, they follow the same decrease. And then it goes back up, because now that there's fewer lynx to eat the predators, or to eat the prey increases, followed by predator increase. Okay, so that's just one thing, this interaction between organisms, that can give us a type of population growth. But now I want to look at two specific examples, and these are logistic and exponential growth. So we'll start with what's called the S curve, because it kind of resembles an S, and this is logistic. Okay, so think of population growth curves as a story about what's happened to a population. So in my population, it's going to go like this and have initially slow growth over time. But then things rapidly increase, kind of like my prey population. And then we reach a certain point where it's too much. They decrease back down and then settle right about here. And we talked about this in class, and this is what's called the carrying capacity. So let's label this as carrying capacity. And in science, we refer to this variable as K. And carrying capacity, we know, is the amount of organisms, so this could be plants, animals, people, that a specific ecosystem can support. So if I'm going to annotate my graph, so this is how we would describe the trends. is we have initially slow growth, but once the population gets to a certain point, we get fast growth. But we've overshot our carrying capacity, so we have to have some die-off. So this is our overshoot, where there's too many organisms that can be supported by the ecosystem. We have to get a die-off. And then there's some fluctuations here and there, but they pretty much then land right around the carrying capacity, because that's where the ecosystem is happy. It's a waste of resources to be down here, so this is waste. And above here is not sustainable, which is why we have to have that die off. So again, this is time and population. Okay, so that's one type of population growth, but we also get what's called exponential. Okay, and this is a little bit different. So this one is time down here, population over here, noticing a trend with my axes labels. So I'm going to do this one in green. So this one, much like the beginning of a logistic growth curve, increases and then it just keeps going. So we call this the J curve because it looks an awful lot like a J. And this one seems like it's going to just keep increasing, 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 increasing. And there's no carrying capacity here. So in the logistic growth, we talked about overshoot and die-off. So what are things that can limit a population? We can kind of break these into two different categories. So I'm going to start with this one over here with all the people. And this is what we call density dependent. Meaning, the population is limited because of their size. So it depends on the population size. I'm just going to write pop size. And it's important to note these are usually biotic things. They're usually because of living things. So examples of this would be disease. So diseases are spread more in a closer population. We're living through this right now. How do we reduce disease? We spread out. So it's a density dependent because it matters how many of an organism there are. This could also be related to predation. That's what we call predators. So predation depends on population size. You're going to be able to eat more when there's more in a smaller area. If your prey is really spread out, then you're not going to have a very high chance of success. It could also be related to the amount of organisms would be your food source. So food can limit your population. That is definitely depending on the size. So if you have too many organisms and not enough food, again, remember our pyramid has to be shaped this way for a reason, because if it was the other way around, it wouldn't work out. So what are the things that are not density dependent? They are called density independent. And these let's rephrase this. Let's write pop size doesn't matter, because these are things that are usually abiotic. So these are usually just things that happen. Examples of this could be weather. So a snowstorm could wipe out a population because the temperature becomes too low and organisms die, therefore their population goes down, but it has nothing to do with how many there were. The snowstorm just happened. It could be temperature related. Could be the amount of light. If you had plants growing in a bucket and then you put a lid on it, eventually they would die. It had nothing to do with the number of plants there were and everything to do with the sunlight. It can also be natural disasters like volcanoes, earthquakes, tornadoes. Doesn't matter how many there are, just things that happen. So the last little important part of ecosystem dynamics is this idea of the keystone species. And this right here is the keystone. So this is a type of Roman architecture that was built with this arch, and it all is supported by this one block. And if you remove that, this entire thing will crumble. And this is a really good metaphor for what we see in our ecosystems. So keystone species, we kind of use the term that some are more equal than others in an ecosystem. So everybody is important in an ecosystem because everybody relies on somebody else, but the ecosystem can survive some losses. So sometimes if you lose an organism, they eat other food, so it's not a big deal. But some are so important that the entire ecosystem will change if they're removed. So a keystone species changes the entire ecosystem if removed. So these are usually catastrophic changes. And we talked about this. I'm going to draw like a little, that's not the right color. I want like a purpley pink. Okay. Starfish. To remind you that this originally came from, that's a terrible looking starfish, from Robert Payne, who discovered the idea of a keystone species when he took starfish and hurled them out into the ocean and discovered that the entire tide pool was forever changed by the loss of these starfish. We call this change a trophic cascade. So this is like a side effect of removing or reducing a species, particularly the keystone. So let's write trophic cascade. So remember, trophic has to do with food, and this is a side effect. In an ecosystem. When a species is reduced or removed, and typically the species is higher up in the food chain and causes huge downstream changes. So for example, let me put a little example right here. And if you don't have room inside your keystone species arch, you can write it next to it. You're going to have more room than I do. Let's say I had the starfish, right? And the starfish ate the snails. They ate the algae. But if I wipe out my starfish, my snail population goes, I'll do that through the roof. As a result, my algae population goes down, and all the things that depend on the algae go totally haywire, and eventually the entire ecosystem can collapse. So this is the keystone species, causes huge downstream changes. So that is a summary of the things we've learned about so far for population growth.